When the Spanish soldiers first saw the city, some of them thought they were dreaming. One of them, a foot soldier named Bernal Diaz del Castillo, wrote it down decades later as an old man, and you can still feel the astonishment through the centuries. They came down from the mountain passes between the two great volcanoes and saw spread out below them a vast lake, and rising out of the water a white city of towers and temples and causeways, gleaming, enormous, connected to the shore by broad stone roads. Diaz said that some of the soldiers asked whether what they saw was real, or whether it was an enchantment out of a book of chivalry. These were hard-traveled men, and the sight of Tenochtitlan stopped them cold. It was, at that moment, almost certainly larger than any city in Spain. Larger than Madrid, larger than Seville, one of the largest cities on the entire planet. 2 years later, that city was rubble, and most of the people you would have seen in that first dazzled glance were dead. This is the story of how that happened, and it is not the story you were probably told. Because the story most of us learned of a few hundred Spaniards with steel swords and horses and guns conquering an empire of millions almost by magic is wrong in its bones. The truth is at once less flattering to the conquerors and more interesting, and it has two names that the legend keeps quiet: allies and disease. First, the city itself, because you cannot feel the scale of the loss without it. Tenochtitlan was the capital of the Mexica, the people we usually call the Aztecs. And it was founded by their own tradition in the year 1325 on a swampy island in the middle of a lake, Lake Texcoco, in the high valley where Mexico City stands today. The legend was that their god told them to settle where they saw an eagle perched on a cactus devouring a serpent. And they saw it on that island, and so they built there on ground that was barely ground at all. That eagle on the cactus is on the Mexican flag to this day. What they did with that island is one of the great feats of engineering in the pre-modern world. They expanded it with artificial land. They built chinampas, often called floating gardens, though they did not float. They were rectangular plots of incredibly fertile reclaimed soil, staked out in the shallow lake bed and built up with mud and rotted vegetation, producing several harvests a year and feeding a huge population. They linked the island to the mainland with 3 great causeways, raised stone roads across the water, wide enough, Diaz said, for many horsemen to ride abreast, with wooden bridges over gaps that could be removed for defense. They built an aqueduct from the springs of Chapultepec on the mainland to carry fresh drinking water into the city, because the lake around them was brackish, salty, undrinkable. Remember that aqueduct. It will matter enormously at the end. The Spanish were astonished by the order of the place. Diaz describes the great market in the sister district of Tlatelolco, where, he says, 60,000 people came to buy and sell on a busy day, every kind of good laid out in its own section: gold and feathers and cacao beans, used as money, cloth, pottery, food, medicines, even a section for human waste, collected and sold as fertilizer, and for tanning hides, because nothing was wasted. There were judges sitting in the market to settle disputes on the spot. Moctezuma, the ruler, kept a palace with an aviary of brilliant birds and a menagerie of animals, and the streets were swept and clean in a way that shamed the European cities the soldiers had come from. At the center stood the sacred precinct, dominated by the Temple Massacre, a great double pyramid topped with 2 shrines, rebuilt and enlarged again and again, and its grand dedication in 1487, remembered for mass sacrifices. The population of the city is debated, but reasonable estimates put it somewhere around 200,000 people, possibly more, in the city and its immediate surroundings. The great speaker, the Tlatoani, was Moctezuma II, who presided over an empire that drew tribute from millions across central Mexico. And that word, tribute, is the crack in the foundation, the thing that explains everything that followed. The Aztec Empire was not a unified nation. It was a hegemony. And at its core sat a triple alliance of 3 cities: Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and the smaller Tlacopan, with Tenochtitlan increasingly dominant. Beneath them was a network of conquered and intimidated peoples who paid tribute, goods, labor, and captives to the center. Many of those subject peoples hated their overlords, and with reason. Part of what they paid was human. The Mexica practiced large-scale human sacrifice, and the Spanish recorded with horror the Tzompantli, the great rack on which the skulls of the sacrificed were displayed by the thousands. They fed this in part through tribute and through a peculiar institution called the Flower Wars, ritualized battles fought specifically to capture prisoners for sacrifice. To be a subject of the Aztecs was to live with the knowledge that your sons and daughters might be demanded, marched to the top of that great pyramid, and killed. That resentment was a loaded weapon lying on the ground, and Hernan Cortes, whatever else you think of him, was clever enough to pick it up. Cortes landed on the Gulf Coast in 1519 with a small force, around 500 to 600 men, 16 horses, and a handful of small cannon. That is the number that makes the conquest sound miraculous. It is also deeply misleading because that number never stayed alone for long, and Cortes was not even there with permission. He had sailed from Cuba against the wishes of its governor, Diego Velázquez, who had tried to recall him at the last moment. Cortes was, technically, a renegade, leading an unauthorized expedition, and that detail will come back to bite him at the worst possible time. There's a famous story that he burned his ships so his men could not retreat, and even that is a small myth. He did not burn them. He had them run aground and dismantled, stripping them for usable iron and rope and sails, which is a more deliberate and less theatrical thing, but the effect was the same. There was no going back. He marched inland, and on the way he met the people who would actually win his war for him, the Tlaxcalans. Tlaxcala was an independent state, a confederation that the Aztecs had pointedly never conquered, surrounded and harassed for generations, and used as a convenient enemy for those flower wars. The Tlaxcalans first fought the Spanish hard, in fierce battles that nearly finished Cortes, and then, recognizing both the threat and the opportunity, they made an alliance with him against their old enemy. This was the masterstroke of the entire conquest, and it was as much theirs as his. From this point on, the Spanish were the small, strange core of an army that was overwhelmingly indigenous. Tens of thousands of Tlaxcalan, and later other allied warriors, who knew the land, the language, the politics, and the way of war. Cortes also had an interpreter, without whom none of his diplomacy would have worked. An enslaved Nahua woman the Spanish called Dona Marina, known to history as Malinche, who spoke the local languages and Spanish, and translated not just his words, but the intentions of everyone he met. In November of 1519, Cortes entered Tenochtitlan, and Moctezuma received him, apparently peacefully, lodging the Spanish in a palace within the city. There is a famous claim that the Aztecs believed Cortes might be the returning god Quetzalcoatl, and that this superstition paralyzed Moctezuma. You should treat that story with real suspicion. Most modern historians think it was largely constructed after the conquest, partly by the Spanish to make their victory look divinely ordained, and partly assembled later from indigenous sources, already reinterpreting their own catastrophe. The real Moctezuma was probably doing what any shrewd ruler does, with a small band of dangerous, well-armed strangers backed by his enemies, watching them, hosting them, trying to take their measure. Whatever his reasoning, it failed, because within days, the Spanish seized Moctezuma himself and held him as a hostage inside his own capital, trying to rule the empire through its captive king. That uneasy arrangement held for months, and then it shattered. And it shattered because of two things at once, one from outside and one from inside. From outside, the governor of Cuba finally sent a force to arrest the renegade Cortes, a larger Spanish expedition under Panfilo de Narvaez. Cortes had to march back to the coast to deal with it, leaving his deputy, Pedro de Alvarado, in command of the city. He defeated Narvaez and, crucially, absorbed most of his men into his own force. But while Cortes was away, the inside thing happened. During a great religious festival, the Festival of Tlaxcalan, with the Aztec nobility gathered and dancing in the sacred precinct, Alvarado and his men attacked them. They blocked the exits and slaughtered the unarmed celebrants. Thousands of them, the political and religious elite of the city, cut down in the temple courtyard. Whatever Alvarado's reasoning, fear, greed for the gold the dancers wore, or a preemptive strike, the result was total. The city rose in fury. Cortes hurried back to a city in open revolt, and the Spanish position collapsed. Moctezuma died at this point, and how he died is genuinely contested. The Spanish accounts say his own people stoned him when he tried to calm them from a rooftop, mortally wounding him. Many indigenous accounts say the Spanish simply killed him when he was no longer useful. We do not know. What we know is that the Spanish and their allies were now trapped in a hostile city of 200,000 people, and they decided to run. The night of the 30th of June into the 1st of July, 1520, is remembered as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. And from the Mexica side, it was a great victory. The Spanish tried to slip out of the city in darkness, along the Tlaquepan Causeway, carrying as much looted gold as they could. The Mexica detected them and attacked from the water in canoes and from the causeway itself. The removable bridges were gone, and the gaps in the causeway became death traps. In the chaos and the dark, men fell into those gaps and into the lake, and many of them, weighed down by the gold they had stuffed into their clothing and packs, sank and drowned. Greed killed them as surely as any weapon. The Spanish lost more than half their men that night, along with most of their horses, their cannon, and most of the treasure. There is a legend that Cortes stopped and wept beneath a tree. Whether or not he wept, the conquest at that moment looked finished. The empire had thrown the invaders out. It should have been the end. It was not. And the reason it was not is the second name the legend keeps quiet: disease. Smallpox arrived in 1520, carried, by most accounts, by a member of that Narvaez expedition from Cuba. The peoples of the Americas had been isolated from the diseases of Europe, Asia, and Africa for thousands of years, and they had no inherited immunity to smallpox at all. The virus tore through central Mexico like fire through dry grass. It swept Tenochtitlan in the months after the Night of Sorrows, and it did not kill soldiers in battle. It killed everyone indiscriminately in their homes. The indigenous accounts collected later in the Florentine Codex describe it with unbearable clarity. People covered in sores so thick they could not move, could not lie on their backs or their stomachs, unable to fetch water or food, whole households dying together, the dead too many to bury. Estimates of the death toll across the region run to a staggering share of the population, commonly cited around a third to nearly half in the worst hit areas in this first epidemic alone. Among the dead was the new Tlatoani, Cuauhtemoc, the very man who had led the successful resistance that drove the Spanish out. He had reigned for about 80 days before the disease killed him. The Mexica lost not only enormous numbers of people, but much of their leadership, their warriors, and their farmers at the exact moment they needed all of it. An enemy they could not see, could not fight, and could not understand was destroying them from inside while the Spanish regrouped on the friendly territory of Tlaxcala. And regroup they did, with their allies, into something far more dangerous than the small band that had first marched up from the coast. The alliance grew. Even Texcoco, one of the three cities of the Triple Alliance itself, split. And a faction under a prince, remembered as Ixtlilxochitl, threw in with Cortes, bringing the resources of a major lake city against its own former partners. Cortes received reinforcements of his own, more men, more horses, more powder. But the decisive preparation was indigenous in its labor and brilliant in its logic. Cortes understood that he had lost the first time because the Mexica controlled the lake. As long as canoes could move freely on the water, the city could be supplied and the causeways defended. So he decided to take the lake. He had 13 brigantines built, small, shallow ships fitted with sails and cannon. They were constructed in pieces at Tlaxcala, inland, far from any sea. And then thousands of Tlaxcalan porters carried the prefabricated timbers, the rigging, and the iron dozens of miles over the mountains to the lakeshore where they were assembled and launched. An inland navy carried on human backs across a mountain range to conquer a city in a lake. The siege of Tenochtitlan began in May of 1521 and lasted about 93 days, roughly 3 months, and it was one of the most terrible sieges in history. The last Tlatoani, a young man named Cuauhtemoc, led the defense with real ferocity and courage. He even captured a number of Spaniards in one fierce counterattack and had them sacrifice on the Great Pyramid in full view of their comrades, the drums sounding as their hearts were cut out to break Spanish morale. But Cortes now held every advantage that mattered. The brigantines swept the Mexica canoes from the lake and severed the causeways, cutting the city off. He had something on the order of tens of thousands of indigenous allies, by some estimates well over 100,000 across the campaign, doing the bulk of the fighting and dying. And he did the one thing guaranteed to break a city built in a salt lake. He cut the aqueduct from Chapultepec. The fresh water stopped. The defenders were left to drink the brackish water of the lake, and they sickened from it. The fighting was not the swift, heroic clash of the legend. It was a grinding, street by street, house by house demolition. Every time the Spanish and their allies took a section of the city, they tore the buildings down and filled the canals with the rubble, so that the Mexica could not use the canals to counterattack, and so that the dreaded horses could maneuver on solid ground. They were not just conquering the city, they were unbuilding it, block by block, advancing across a growing field of their own destruction. Inside the shrinking Mexica-held core, people were dying of thirst, of starvation, and of disease, packed into an ever smaller space, eating lizards, bark, and mud bricks soaked in old water, refusing again and again to surrender. The indigenous chronicles preserve the grief of it in poetry. Broken spears lie in the roads, they wrote. We have torn our hair in our grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood. Cuauhtemoc held out long past the point of any hope. On the 13th of August, 1521, it ended. Cuauhtemoc tried to escape across the lake by canoe and was captured by one of the brigantines. With his capture, resistance collapsed. The city, the marvel that had stopped hardened soldiers in their tracks 2 years earlier, was a ruin choked with the dead. The number who died in the siege from combat, starvation, thirst, and disease is uncountable, but it runs well into the tens of thousands and very probably far higher. The Spanish and their allies walked into a graveyard, and even the allies were sickened by the slaughter their victory had become. What came after is its own bitter epilogue. Cuauhtemoc, the captured young king, was tortured by the Spanish, who burned his feet with oil to make him reveal where the lost gold of the Night of Sorrows had gone. He survived that, only to be executed by Cortes a few years later, in 1525, hanged during an expedition to Honduras on a suspicion of conspiracy that may have been nothing at all. The Spanish demolished what remained of Tenochtitlan and built their own capital, Mexico City, directly on top of it, on the same island, using the same stones, raising their cathedral beside the rubble of the Temple Massacre. Over the following centuries, they drained the Great Lake almost entirely, so that the city that was once a wonder afloat on the water now sits on dry, slowly sinking ground. And the dying did not stop with the siege. Wave after wave of new diseases swept the survivors over the following decades, including a catastrophic epidemic that now was called Cocolistli, until the indigenous population of central Mexico had collapsed by perhaps 90% from what it had been when Bernal Diaz first looked down from the pass. And the allies, the Tlaxcalans, and the others who had truly won the war, the tens of thousands without whom 500 Spaniards would have been a footnote, a band that died on a causeway one dark night in 1520. They won the war and they lost the peace. Tlaxcala secured some privileges and exemptions for a time in recognition of its role, and held onto a measure of autonomy longer than most. But in the end, they too became subjects of the Spanish crown, their crucial part in the conquest gradually written out of a story that preferred a cleaner, simpler, more miraculous version in which a handful of bold men and their god overthrew an empire of pagans through sheer destiny. That is the version worth correcting, because the real one tells you something true about how empires actually fall. Tenochtitlan was not conquered by 500 men. It was brought down by the hatred of the people it had oppressed, organized into an army of its own neighbors, and by a microscopic organism that no one in 1521 even knew existed, which did more killing than every sword and cannon combined. The steel and the horses and the ships mattered at the edges. The Allies and the smallpox decided it. In 1978, electrical workers digging in the heart of modern Mexico City struck a massive carved stone and uncovered the buried base of the Temple Massacre, the Great Pyramid, still there, directly beneath the streets, where it had been all along. The city the Spanish tried to erase has been quietly surfacing through the pavement of the one they built on its grave ever since.